I never planned on humiliating my family in front of half the town. But when my mother smiled across the dinner table and said, "Maybe one day you'll finally catch up to your brother," something inside me snapped so violently that I physically froze. The restaurant around us kept moving like normal. Glasses clinked. People laughed. A waitress walked past carrying steaks on a tray. Meanwhile, I just sat there staring at my mother, trying to process how she could say something so casually cruel after everything that had happened over the last 10 years. And the craziest part? She said it while wearing the watch I bought her. Not Mason. Me. But everyone at that table thought my brother bought it because my mother had spent the entire evening bragging about him like he personally cured cancer. I remember gripping my fork so hard my fingers hurt. Across from me, Mason smirked into his whiskey glass without even trying to hide it. That smirk, God, I hated that smirk. Not because he was better than me, but because he genuinely believed he was. By the end of that dinner, my mother was crying in the bathroom. My father was staring at the table in shame. And Mason finally heard the one thing nobody in our family had ever dared say to his face. "You didn't win because you were better. You won because Mom rigged the game for you your entire life." But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Caleb. I'm 27 years old from Ohio, and for most of my life I existed as the other son. Not the bad son. Not the screw-up. Honestly, that would have been easier. No, I was the invisible son, the reliable one, the quiet one. The kid who handled his own problems so nobody noticed when he was hurting. My older brother Mason was 30 now, and according to my mother, he was basically perfection in human form. Football captain in high school, business degree, natural charisma. The loud, confident guy everybody noticed when he walked into a room. Meanwhile, I was the awkward younger brother who liked computers, worked part-time through college, and avoided attention whenever possible. To outsiders, it probably looked like normal sibling differences. Inside the house, it felt like living beside a celebrity I could never compete with, and my mother made sure I knew it. Constantly. Growing up, Mason didn't just get more attention. He got different rules. When Mason got a B in school, my parents said teachers were unfair. When I got a B, they asked why I didn't study harder. When Mason forgot chores, my mother laughed and called him scatterbrained. When I forgot chores, she said I was irresponsible. Little things like that stack up over years. People who grow up in healthy families don't really understand how damaging favoritism becomes when it's subtle enough to deny. Because if your parents openly hate you, at least you know where you stand. But when they insist they love both children equally, while treating one kid like an investment and the other like background furniture, you spend years wondering if maybe you really are the problem. I used to chase my mother's approval like an addict. I still remember being 12 years old and bringing home straight A's for the first time. I thought she'd finally look proud of me. Instead, she smiled for about 2 seconds before saying, "That's great, honey. Your brother scored 3 touchdowns tonight, too." That was my childhood in one sentence. Every achievement became a comparison. Every moment somehow circled back to Mason. Birthdays were worse. One year, my parents spent almost $3,000 helping Mason buy a used Mustang after graduation. Know what I got when I graduated? A handshake. My mom literally said, "You're easier, Caleb, you don't need as much." At the time, I laughed like it didn't hurt. But those comments stay inside you. They grow teeth. The older we got, the more obvious the favoritism became. My parents helped Mason pay rent after college because starting adulthood is hard. Meanwhile, I worked night shifts at a warehouse while attending classes because my father told me, "You need to learn independence." Funny how independence only applied to one son. Still, I kept trying. I told myself if I worked hard enough, eventually they'd see me differently. Eventually they'd be proud. Eventually my mother would look at me the same way she looked at Mason, like I mattered. I wasted years believing that. Here's the thing nobody outside our family understood. Mason wasn't actually successful because he worked harder. He just had a safety net. A massive one. If he failed, my parents caught him. Every single time. When he crashed his car at 22 driving drunk, Dad paid the lawyer. When he lost 2 jobs in 1 year, Mom covered his rent. When he maxed out his credit cards trying to impress people, my parents quietly bailaid him out, again, and again, and again. Meanwhile, I learned how to survive alone because nobody was coming to save me. At first, that felt unfair. Then eventually it became my biggest advantage. While Mason spent money trying to look rich, I learned how to actually build stability. I worked through college, graduated debt-free, started doing freelance software work, then landed a cybersecurity job in Columbus that completely changed my life. By 26, I was making more money than my brother ever had. Nobody in my family knew, mostly because they never asked. Mason talked constantly about himself, so family conversations naturally revolved around him. His promotions, his dating life, his gym routine, his networking. Meanwhile, if I mentioned work for more than 30 seconds, my mother's eyes glazed over instantly. So eventually I stopped talking. And honestly, the silence taught me something important. People reveal exactly how much they value you by how curious they are about your life. My family knew almost nothing about me because knowing me was never important to them. But they knew everything about Mason. Every detail, every story, every excuse. The funniest part. Despite all the praise my mother poured onto him, Mason was drowning financially by the time he turned 30. He just hit it well. Luxury apartment, designer clothes, leased BMW, expensive watches. All funded by debt and appearances. I knew because about 8 months before the dinner, he drunkenly called me asking for money. Not a little either. $15,000. He framed it as an investment opportunity. But after 20 minutes of listening to him ramble, I realized he was desperate. I told him no. That was the first time in our lives I think he truly saw me as a threat instead of background noise. And after that, the tension between us changed completely. The retirement dinner was for my grandfather, 80 years old, worked 45 years in construction. One of the only people in my family who treated me like I existed. When Grandpa invited me, he specifically asked me not to skip it this time. "You disappear too much these days," he told me over the phone. I almost laughed at that. Disappear. Funny word for what happens when a family slowly teaches you your presence doesn't matter. Still, I loved my grandfather, so I drove down that Saturday evening. The restaurant was one of those fake fancy steakhouse places suburban people use for special occasions. Dark wood walls, leather booths, overpriced whiskey. My parents were already there when I arrived. Mom hugged me quickly before immediately turning back toward Mason mid-conversation. Typical. Dad gave me an awkward nod. Mason leaned back in his chair wearing one of those tight-fitted shirts dudes buy after discovering podcasts about alpha mindset. "Caleb," he said with that smug grin. "Didn't know you still came to family events." I ignored it and greeted Grandpa instead. Dinner started normal enough, but over the next hour the conversation slowly became what it always became. The Mason show. Mom bragged about his business connections. Dad talked about Mason's confidence. Mason himself kept humble bragging every 5 minutes. Meanwhile, nobody asked me a single question, not one. I could have announced I was moving to another country, and I genuinely think half the table wouldn't have noticed. Then came the watch conversation. My aunt complimented my mother's Rolex. And before I could even sip my drink, Mom smiled proudly and said, "Mason surprised me with it for my birthday." I actually blinked, because no, he absolutely did not. I bought that watch 6 months earlier after my mother casually mentioned always wanting one someday. I saved for it carefully, spent weeks researching, and gave it to her privately because I thought maybe for once she'd see me. But now she was crediting Mason. He didn't even correct her. He just sat there smiling. That's when something inside me finally started dying. I should have let it go. Honestly, that's probably what the old version of me would have done. Smile politely, stay quiet. Drive home angry, replay the conversation in my head for 3 days. But something about watching Mason accept credit for my gift, while my mother practically glowed with pride, finally broke whatever was left of my patience. I set my glass down slowly. "Actually," I said, looking directly at Mom, "I bought you that watch." The table went quiet, not dramatic movie quiet, real quiet. The uncomfortable kind where people suddenly become very interested in their mashed potatoes. Mom blinked at me like I'd interrupted something important. "Oh," she said awkwardly. "Right, yes, you helped." "Helped," I actually laughed. Mason leaned back in his chair immediately. "Bro, relax. It's just a misunderstanding." "No," I said calmly. "A misunderstanding is forgetting who paid for dinner. You literally took credit for a gift I spent months saving for." Dad cleared his throat. "Caleb, this isn't really the time." And there it was, the family rule: never embarrass Mason, never challenge Mason. Never make things uncomfortable for the golden child. Meanwhile, I'd spent my entire life swallowing discomfort to protect everyone else. I looked at my mother. "You really didn't even remember who bought it?" She looked offended now, which honestly amazed me. "Don't start this tonight," she snapped quietly. "Start what?" "Reality." Grandpa was staring between all of us without speaking. Mason smirked again and took a sip of whiskey. "You're acting jealous," he said. That word, jealous. My entire childhood reduced into one insulting little word. Like every painful memory in my head was just envy instead of years of favoritism. And that's when my mother delivered the line that changed everything. She sighed dramatically and said, "Caleb, nobody's attacking you. Mason's just farther ahead in life right now. Maybe someday you'll catch up too." The second she said it, something inside me went completely still. Not angry, not emotional, just done. 27 years of trying to earn love suddenly felt embarrassing. Because I finally understood something. There was no finish line, no achievement that would make her see me differently. No amount of success that could compete with the fantasy version of Mason she created in her head. And once I realized that, I stopped being afraid. I leaned back in my chair and looked directly at my brother. "Catch up," I repeated quietly. Mason smiled like he'd already won. So I nodded slowly and said the sentence that detonated our entire family. "Mason, you borrowed money from 3 different people this year because you couldn't pay your rent." Silence. Complete silence. Mason's expression dropped instantly. Mom frowned. "What?" I kept going. "You asked me for $15,000 8 months ago because your credit cards were maxed out." "Caleb," Mason warned sharply. "No," I said, "you don't get to play successful after spending your entire adult life being rescued." Dad stared at him now. Mom looked confused. Mason laughed nervously. "He's exaggerating." "Am I?" I asked. Then I pulled out my phone. Because unlike my brother, I learned a long time ago to keep receipts. I opened the messages and slid my phone across the table. Dad picked it up first. I watched his face slowly change while he scrolled through months of texts from Mason begging for money. Paragraphs, excuses, promises to repay me, screenshots of overdue bills. At one point, Mason literally wrote, "Please don't tell Mom and Dad, I just need one more bailout." Dad's jaw tightened. Mom grabbed the phone next. "Mason," she whispered, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched the golden image crack, not completely. Not enough, but enough. Mason immediately switched tactics. "What, you think you're better than me because you hoard money and sit behind a computer all day?" There it was. The insecurity, the real reason he always mocked me. Because deep down he knew something terrifying. I built my life without help. Everything I had belonged to me. No bailouts, no rescue missions, no emotional support. Just years of working quietly while everyone ignored me. I looked at him calmly. "No," I said, "I think I'm better than you because I don't pretend to be self-made while living off other people." Mom slammed the phone onto the table. "Enough," she snapped, but her voice sounded shaky now. Because suddenly the narrative wasn't working anymore. Suddenly her successful, perfect son looked exactly like what he really was. A 30-year-old man addicted to appearances. Mason stood up fast enough to shake the table. "You've always been bitter," he said. "No," I replied. "I was hurt. There's a difference." That shut him up for half a second. And once I finally started talking, years of buried resentment came pouring out before I could stop it. "You know what the funniest part is?" I said, looking at both my parents now. "I spent most of my life believing I wasn't good enough because you treated him like he was special." Mom looked horrified. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. "But he's not special," I continued. "He's just loud, and you confused confidence with competence for 30 years. "Caleb," Dad started. "No, Dad, you don't get to interrupt now." That shocked even me. Because I'd never spoken to my father like that before, ever. The whole table was staring openly now. My aunt looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Grandpa remained completely silent, but he was watching me with this strange expression I couldn't understand at the time. Not disappointment, something else, pride. "You want to know why I stopped visiting?" I asked quietly. "Because every single time I came home, I left feeling smaller." Mom started crying instantly. Actual tears. And for a second, younger me almost folded. You spend enough years emotionally starving for parental love, and even fake guilt from them still affects you. But then she said the one thing that killed that sympathy immediately. "We did our best," I laughed, a sharp, ugly laugh I didn't even recognize as my own. "No," I said. "You did your best for him." Nobody talked for almost 10 seconds after that. The entire table felt poisoned. Then Grandpa slowly put down his fork, and in a calm voice that somehow carried more weight than everyone else yelling combined, he said, "He's right." My mother looked stunned. "Dad, no," Grandpa interrupted. "He's right." I had never seen my mother speechless before, ever. Grandpa looked at her with genuine disappointment. "You treated that boy like he was temporary his whole life." Mom started shaking her head immediately. "That's not true." Yes, it is, Grandpa replied. Then he turned toward me. You know why Caleb always sat with me at family parties when he was little? Nobody answered. Because nobody else noticed when he was alone. That hit harder than everything else combined, because it was true. I used to follow Grandpa around family gatherings because he was the only person who actually asked me questions. The only one who listened to my answers. Grandpa sighed heavily. Mason got praise for existing. Caleb got praised when he was useful. Mom started crying harder now. Dad looked sick. And Mason, for the first time in his life, he looked scared, not angry, not smug, scared. Because when family systems break, golden children panic. They build their identities around being untouchable. The second accountability enters the room, everything shakes. Dad finally spoke quietly. We never meant to hurt you. I looked at him for a long moment, and honestly, that almost made it worse. Because intentional cruelty at least has logic, but neglect caused by convenience, that's colder somehow. I know, I said softly. That's the problem. Mom whispered my name like she wanted forgiveness right there. But I was exhausted. Not angry anymore, just emotionally exhausted. Years of pain had finally surfaced all at once, and suddenly I understood why I'd been distancing myself from them more every year. My body learned the truth before my mind did. They drained me. I stood up slowly and grabbed my jacket. Mom panicked immediately. Please don't leave like this. Like this funny phrase. As if there was a clean way to leave a family after realizing you were emotionally invisible for most of your life. I looked at her one last time. You spent so many years trying to make me feel less than him, I said quietly, that you never noticed I stopped competing a long time ago. Nobody spoke. Then I added the line that haunted my mother afterward, according to my dad. I didn't fall behind Mason, I just stopped needing your approval to feel valuable. And then I walked out. Alone. For the first time in my life, feeling free. I drove home with the windows down even though it was freezing outside. My hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I almost pulled over twice. Not because I regretted what I said. Because I couldn't believe I finally said it. People who grow up in healthy families don't understand how terrifying it feels to confront parents after years of emotional conditioning. Even when you're right, your body still feels guilty. The second I got home, I threw my keys onto the counter and just stood in my apartment staring at the wall in silence. Then my phone started vibrating. Mom. I ignored it. 3 more calls came immediately after. Then Dad. Then Mason. I ignored all of them. A minute later, another call came through. Grandpa, that one I answered. You okay, kid? He asked quietly. And for some reason, that simple question almost broke me. Because nobody in my family had asked me that in years. I sat down heavily on my couch and rubbed my face. Yeah, I lied. Grandpa snorted softly. Terrible liar, you always were. I laughed weakly. Then silence settled between us for a second before he sighed. You said what needed saying. I feel like I detonated a bomb. You did, he replied calmly. Sometimes bombs clear foundations that should have collapsed years ago. That sentence stayed with me. We talked another 20 minutes before hanging up. Apparently the dinner completely imploded after I left. Mom locked herself in the bathroom crying. Dad and Mason got into an argument in the parking lot. And according to Grandpa, my aunt finally admitted the entire family noticed the favoritism years ago, but nobody wanted to confront it. That hurt more than I expected, because it meant people saw what was happening. They just let it happen anyway. Before hanging up, Grandpa said something else I'll never forget. Your mother loved you, Caleb. She just loved your brother louder. At the time, I didn't know whether that made me feel better or worse. The next morning, I woke up to 11 unread texts. Most were from Mom. Please talk to me. I didn't realize you felt this way. You embarrassed your brother unnecessarily. We need to discuss this as a family. I love you. That third message irritated me immediately. Even after everything, part of her still worried more about Mason being embarrassed than why I exploded in the first place. Classic. Dad's message was different. Can we meet? Just us. I almost ignored him too, but something told me I should go. We met at a small diner halfway between our towns later that afternoon. And honestly, I barely recognized my father when he walked in. He looked exhausted. Older somehow, like one dinner aged him 5 years. He sat across from me awkwardly and immediately said, I owe you an apology. That alone shocked me. My father wasn't emotional, didn't discuss feelings, didn't admit mistakes. Ever. He stared into his coffee for a long time before speaking again. I think your mother and I convinced ourselves you were fine because you never demanded anything. I stayed quiet. You handled problems alone, he continued. You didn't get into trouble, didn't ask for help, didn't need much. I almost laughed, didn't need much. Parents say that about children like it's natural, but kids don't stop needing things, they just stop believing asking matters. Dad rubbed his face tiredly. The truth is, he paused heavily, Mason always required management, you required trust. That's not an excuse. I know. For the first time in my life, my father looked genuinely ashamed. Then he dropped a sentence that stunned me completely. Your mother's terrified of your brother failing. I frowned. What? He's been financially unstable for years, Dad admitted quietly. Longer than you know. Apparently my parents had been secretly helping Mason for almost a decade. Car payments, debt, rent, business, investments, all of it, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The favoritism wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become maintenance. My parents spent so much energy protecting Mason from consequences that they unconsciously neglected the child who survived independently. Not because I mattered less, but because I demanded less attention, and somehow that hurt even more. Dad finally looked at me directly. You became successful quietly, he said, and I don't think we noticed fast enough. I stared at him for a long moment before answering. No, I said softly, you just noticed too late. 3 days later, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. Classic mom move. I opened the door and immediately saw she'd been crying again. No makeup, red eyes, holding a grocery bag like this was somehow a normal visit. For a second, we just stared at each other awkwardly. Then she whispered, "Can I come in?" Part of me wanted to say no. Another part, the little boy who spent years craving her attention, still wanted her approval badly enough to let her inside instantly. So I stepped aside. She walked into my apartment slowly, looking around like she'd never really seen my life before. Which, honestly, she hadn't. Her eyes lingered on the furniture, the office setup, the framed certifications on my wall. You did really well for yourself, she said quietly. I almost laughed at the irony. 27 years old. First time she ever said that sentence to me. She sat down carefully at my kitchen table and started crying before she even spoke again. I didn't know you hated us this much. That irritated me immediately, because parents like her always translated pain into accusation. I sat across from her. I don't hate you. Then why would you humiliate us like that? There it was again. Not, why were you hurting? Not, how did we miss this? No, why did you embarrass us? Image first, always. I spent years swallowing this quietly, I said. That dinner was the first time I stopped protecting everybody else. Mom wiped her eyes shakily. I loved both of you equally. No, I replied gently. You loved us differently. That silence afterward felt enormous. Then finally, in the softest voice imaginable, she asked, was I really that unfair? And God, that question destroyed me, because she sounded sincere. Like she genuinely didn't know. People think favoritism always comes from malice. Sometimes it comes from fear. My mother saw Mason as fragile and me as stable. So she poured energy toward the child she thought needed rescuing. The problem is, children notice where love flows, even when parents think they're hiding it. I leaned back in my chair tiredly. You know what hurt the most? I asked quietly. She shook her head. You celebrated him for potential, I said, but you only noticed me when I was useful. Mom broke down crying again after that, real crying, the ugly kind. And for the first time in years, I actually believed she understood what she'd done, at least partly. 2 weeks later, Mason called me drunk. Again, only this time he wasn't asking for money, he was furious. You think you're some kind of hero now? He slurred. I stayed calm. You called me. You turned Mom against me. That told me everything. Even after the dinner, he still saw himself as the victim. No, I replied. I stopped letting everyone pretend. You've always been jealous of me. I actually laughed. Not angrily, just genuinely. Because for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't jealous of Mason at all. I pitied him. He spent 30 years building an identity entirely around external validation. Attention, praise, admiration. Without it, he collapsed instantly. Meanwhile, I learned how to survive without approval so early that independence became second nature. You know the difference between us? I asked quietly. What, if everyone stopped clapping for you tomorrow, you wouldn't know who you are? Silence, then breathing, heavy breathing. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. Mason was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like a kid. My whole life, he whispered drunkenly, they told me I had to be exceptional. That hit me unexpectedly hard, because suddenly I saw the truth. Favoritism damaged both of us. I became invisible. Mason became addicted to being admired. Neither of us got to become normal. That didn't excuse him, but it explained him. We stayed silent for a long time before he muttered, "I think I'm drowning." And honestly, that was the first truthful thing my brother had said to me in years. About 2 months later, Grandpa invited everyone over again. Smaller dinner this time, just immediate family. Nobody wanted to go, which probably meant we actually needed to. The tension walking into that house could have powered a small city. Mom looked nervous. Dad looked exhausted. Mason looked humbled for maybe the first time ever. And me? I just felt tired. Dinner started awkwardly, painfully awkwardly. But then something strange happened. People started telling the truth, actual truth. Dad admitted they relied on me emotionally because I seemed strong. Mom admitted she confused helping Mason with loving him. And Mason admitted he built his entire personality around impressing people because he thought failure would make everyone stop loving him. That one hit the room hard. At some point, Mom started crying again and apologized directly to me. Not vague parent apologies either. Specific ones, for comparisons, for dismissing achievements, for assuming I needed less love because I asked for less attention. And for the first time in my life, I believed her. Not because she suddenly became perfect, but because accountability finally entered the room. Families don't heal because people cry. They heal because people tell the truth. Before everyone left, Grandpa pulled me aside quietly. "You know what your problem was growing up?" he asked. I smirked. "I'm sure you'll tell me," he smiled. "You spent too many years trying to win a competition nobody else knew existed." That sentence changed something inside me permanently, because he was right. My mother comparing us created a race in my head that consumed years of my life. And the moment I stopped running, I became free. Things still aren't perfect, probably never will be. My mother overcompensates sometimes now. Dad tries harder. Mason's in therapy, which honestly shocked everybody. And me? I finally stopped measuring my value through people who couldn't see me clearly. That changed everything. A few months ago, Mom invited me to dinner alone. Near the end of the night, she looked at me quietly and said, "I'm proud of the man you became." Simple sentence. Most people hear that from parents all the time. For me, it felt like hearing rain after years in a desert. But the strange thing is, by then I didn't need it anymore. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not revenge, not humiliation, freedom. Because the moment you stop begging people to validate your worth, you finally realize how valuable you were the entire time.